I don't want no oil, a spoil in my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes!
Good morning, Toledo and Bowling Green, and good afternoon, Columbus, and hello to all those listening on the internet, wherever and whenever you are. My name is Joe DeMare, and I'm here with my fantabulous co-host,
Rebecca Wood, I think.
Well, hopefully you'll have it figured out by the end of the show.
Yeah, I'm going to work on it.
All right. And together, Rebecca and I are going to create an amazing hour of radio called For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a show where we talk about ecology and the environment. And we talk about them in the ways that they affect you, your wealth, your health, your happiness, the wealth and health and happiness of your friends and your families and your coworkers and the sperm whales and the giant squid that the sperm whales eat and the little squids that the giant squids eat, and basically everybody and everything on the planet, because, like it or not, we are all wrapped up together on this wonderful planet called Earth. And we have another good show for you today on this 17th day of November, 2024. We are going to be chatting just for another 10 minutes or so, and at any time during this time, feel free to call in, and please do call in, 877-909-1007, 877-909-1007, about any ecological or environmental issue that you're concerned about. And after we chat a bit, we have a report from COP29 over there in Baku, Azerbaijan, where a bunch of bureaucrats from around the world are trying to save the world. So far, this is the 29th one. So far, they have not done a very good job of it.
Do they have proposals and committees, Joe?
They've got, like crazy, man.
So many.
So many. And
if that can't save us, I don't know what will.
And some of our friends are there, some of the, organizations that we've interviewed on this show over the years. And there was a nice little press conference that was organized by NEARS. Downloaded that press conference, and that's what we're going to have for an interview today. Then, Rebecca, what will you be talking about?
I will be talking about men's health.
Men's health, okay.
In honor of International Man's Day on Tuesday, I believe it is.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's our day, gosh.
That's right. You can all man it up.
All right. Looking forward
Superman
to that.
Day. Eat lots of fruits and vegetables.
Oh, okay. All right. And then that's Ecological News comes after that, and that is our show. So it's very nice. It's going to be another nice day today. High is supposed to be 58 degrees, which, according to my weather app on my phone, is about 10 degrees above average. And now the thing is, of course, they only take the average going back to 1970. So if you took the average all the way back to, let's say, 1900 or so, it would be much more than 10 degrees above average. And there is no, in the long-range forecast, again, on my Apple weather app, there's no freezing. There might be a little bit of frost here and there, but no below freezing air temperatures all the way through to the end of November. And so we have officially entered the season that I call gray, which is the season where it's not really cold, but the leaves are all down and the trees have, it's all looking kind of gray, except this year.
It's arthritis.
Yeah, arthritis season. Yeah.
Arthritis comes but twice a year and lasts about 6 months now.
There you go. But this year, gray has a little more color than usual because I'm noticing flowers are continuing to bloom. This week I saw some coreopsis. I saw a rose bush that was just in full bloom. There are no bees, though, visiting any of these flowers because the bees are like, it's November, dude.
Yeah.
I'm not going out there. You go out there.
They're on a whole different page from the flowers.
Yes. So it's not working out in that relationship. But
well, then how did they bloom? Okay, wait a minute. They bloom.
They bloom,
most
right.
of them, and then the bees come and pollinate them, and then they go to seed, right? That's how it works.
That's how it's supposed to work.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But when you start blooming in late November, you're just kind of wasting your energy. But it's important to remember that while it's nice here, in the rest of the world, things are not looking so good. In fact, in California, they just had a haboob.
For starters, I'm still having trouble breathing while I walk the dog.
Oh, from the wildfire
Yeah.
smokes. Yeah. Well, they had a haboob in California, which is a gigantic sandstorm.
Oh my!
Because it's been so dry there that they actually finally did get a little bit of rain, but what that rain did was it put the sand up into the air because it was so dusty. And so there's very dramatic pictures of California getting engulfed in sandstorm. Then, of course, there's flooding all over the place, floods in Sicily, in Central America. Sicily, they lost a fair number of their cars, actually just got washed right into the ocean this
Oopsie
past
doodle.
week. Yeah. Central America is all flooded up because they had Hurricane Sarah came there.
Free cars
this
in the
past week.
Mediterranean, everyone.
Yeah. And, of
Slightly
course,
damp.
Spain is having another round of flooding. This is just 2 weeks after the incredible floods that killed more than 200 people. And, of course, all this is happening after the United States voted for a global warming denier. But as they found out in Florida, just electing people who deny global warming does not actually stop global warming. I think people might have felt like they're voting against global warming when they vote for somebody who says it's not real. But I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way.
It's not a democratic phenomenon.
Yeah, you can't vote global warming away, unfortunately. And as they found in Florida, which is, pretty much doomed. Another thing of doom that often gets associated with global warming is the collapse of the Atlantic current, the current that takes the hot water from like the Gulf of Mexico and brings it up into northern Europe. And there's been a lot of speculation about that, the AMOC current, it's called. And I've seen headlines in news stories that suggest that if it collapses, it'll mean super cold. Some of them have said for all of Europe, and some of them have said for all of the northern hemisphere. And I never bought any of that because there's just too much CO2 in the air, trapping too much heat for I always thought even if AMOC collapses, it's not going to turn us into like.
Okay, I feel like they shouldn't have named it because it's now it's run amok.
It's more amok, yeah, exactly.
It was a bad idea. They should have seen it coming.
So anyway, back in October, a group of atmospheric scientists actually sent a letter to the Nordic Council of Ministers because they actually finally have done the simulations and just, said, well, what will happen if the AMOC current collapses? And what it turns out is that it's going to get super, super cold in the North Atlantic around the Nordic countries. So like Greenland and Norway and Sweden and all those, they will be plunged into pretty much like another ice age practically. But everywhere, literally everywhere else on the globe, like the North Pole, Antarctica, Africa, Asia, here, us, everywhere else is going to roast. So the simulation, the picture, the image they showed with the simulation has this one big blob of like really deep blue over that part of the North Atlantic. but everywhere else is like a really deep red. So that movie, some of you may have remembered the movie The Day After Tomorrow, that was actually released 20 years ago this year. And that was a scary movie, a disaster movie that said, well, if the AMOC collapses, then, all of North America or all of the Northern Hemisphere will be turned into another ice age. And it happened, overnight. But turns out Day After Tomorrow is wrong, that what's going to happen is just that one part of the North Atlantic and the Northern Europe will be plunged into super cold temperatures, and the rest of us we're going to roast. So something to look forward to.
Yay. Well,
yay.
that's cheering.
Yeah. We're not going to freeze here. We're going to roast. Okay.
Okay.
Anyway, so as I said, what's happening right now in Baku, Azerbaijan is COP29, where the leaders of the world are talking desperately about doing something about global warming. And unfortunately, COP has been flooded with pro-nuclear activists, because that's what the mainstream media, or that's what the oil companies do, is whenever anybody starts talking about reducing carbon, they say, oh, well, how about nuclear? Because they know it's going to take at least another 10 years. It's too slow. It's too expensive, etc. And so there is a small contingent of actual true environmentalists there who are lobbying against nuclear power, and I managed to download their press conference off the internet. So let's take a listen to that conference now.
My name is Timothy Judson. I'm with a U.S. NGO called the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, and this is a press conference being held by the Don't Nuke the Climate Coalition. The Don't Nuke the Climate Coalition has been participating in the COP since COP6. And we share a vision of a nuclear-free, carbon-free world run with 100% renewable energy with a just and equitable energy transition. We have a statement that has been signed by 629 NGOs from around the world supporting this agenda, and we are here in opposition to the proposal or the pledge by now 31 countries for a global nuclear energy expansion to triple nuclear energy worldwide by 2050. This is supposed to be the finance COP, and to bring enough climate finance for this just transition and to preserve a livable climate. And what we have heard this week from the nuclear industry here at the COP is actually really illuminating. Earlier this week, there was a number circulated by nuclear industry representatives that the tripling of nuclear energy by 2050 would cost $5 trillion. Now, this is based on a lowball, very, very unrealistically low estimate to build nuclear reactors. But the reality is that the amount of climate finance that's being proposed here at the COP, which is needed to make a huge difference, is $1.3 trillion per year. And so what the nuclear industry is proposing is essentially to swallow whole multiple years of climate finance in order to build this nuclear power agenda. The way that nuclear projects operate around the world is they provide a low estimate, an unrealistically low estimate, in order to get approval. But then quickly the costs start to rise once construction starts. And so what would happen if this agenda is pursued is that the cost in climate finance to bail out nuclear projects around the world would quickly exceed $5 trillion and would really stand in the way of the just energy transition that is needed in order to solve the climate crisis. There's also been a lot of misinformation being told about nuclear power at the COP this week. And so we are here with representatives from a number of organizations in the coalition to shed some light on the realities of what this global nuclear expansion would mean. So first, I'm going to introduce Vladimir Sliviak of the Russian NGO Eco-Defense. It was also the 2021 Right Livelihood Award winner, and I'll pass it to you, Vladimir.
Thank you very much, Tim. First thing I wanted to stress is that, we oppose to using nuclear power as a climate crisis solution for a very simple reason. It takes too long to build nuclear reactors, and we need climate action today, not in 10 or 20 years from now, when nuclear reactors may be completed. And we need cheaper solutions than nuclear. Nuclear, well, if you look into what business says, like for example, one of the leading investment bank, Lazard, who's every year showing the numbers, how much the energy cost, and we can see that new nuclear power plant is the most expensive source of energy among all today. And well, on the contrary, renewable sources of energy are not going to be expensive after time, like nuclear power. It's going to be cheaper and cheaper, and this is what we've seen over the last few decades, that renewable energy became a very cheap one compared to what it was a couple of decades ago. And of course, nuclear power remains dangerous because it produces nuclear waste that will be dangerous for next many thousands of years. It's actually very useful to look at how many new nuclear reactors are under construction around the world right now. It's something like 50 plus of units under construction. But half of this is under construction in different countries by a Russian nuclear power corporation, Rosatom, that belongs to Russian state and funded 100% by Russian state. And that is for a very simple reason, not because nuclear power is cheap and it's good climate solution or anything like that. It's because Russian President Vladimir Putin is so keen to extend his geopolitical influence around the world. And building nuclear power plants around the world is actually a very good instrument for it. It's a good instrument to control especially developing countries, because once you agree once you sign a contract with Rosatom or any other nuclear corporation around the world, you will be dependent for the next 100, actually more than 100 of years, on the specific technology, on the engineers from this country, on the supply of nuclear fuel. And the nuclear fuel is not something like a fossil fuel where you can actually go on the market and select who will supply it to you. With nuclear fuel, you are stuck with a specific company that builds reactor in your country, and it's only this company who can then supply fuel for you. So, I mean, what Russia is doing is basically, well, or Vladimir Putin, Russian president, doing, he's paying from a Russian state budget for all those new reactors that are in construction around the world. And it's because he wants to be influential around the world, not because it's good for climate or it's cheap. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that, well, there is a war that Russia started in Ukraine in the beginning of 2022. And we've seen that Russian nuclear corporation Rosatom been deeply involved in this war. They helped the Russian army to occupy the Chernobyl contaminated with radiation zone in the beginning of war. Then they occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine, and the Russian army is still there. And it's a very good example that's showing how so-called civil nuclear power can be weaponized if there would be a war happening close to this nuclear power plant. And I want to end my statement with saying that we demand peace for Ukraine, war must be stopped immediately, and the Russian army should go back home. Thank you very much.
So next I would like to introduce Makoma Lakalakala of EarthLife Africa, who is also the 2018 Goldman Environmental Prize winner.
Good afternoon. The future will look up to us and ask us what happened. The cost of nuclear power is too huge to be ignored. It's carbon intensive, not a solution to climate change. Nuclear is not a transitional fuel and cannot be part of what we see as a solution towards the crisis that we have of increasing greenhouse gas emissions that are continuing and cannot be stopped. The cost of massive expenditure required by nuclear power is not only less public money spending on key services like health and education, and so it's too costly. The other thing is that when we talk about transition or transitioning towards a low carbon investment, restorative justice, it's at the center. So we would not want, or we don't have to see what's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo continuously happening again, what is happening in Niger, what is happening in Tanzania with uranium mining and people paying with their lives, paying with their land, and that is a cost of nuclear energy, particularly in Africa, and this is what we are saying, that it's costly and we can no longer continue having people paying with their land and their lives. From uranium mining to accidents that have taken people's lives away, that's a cost that we should always keep it in our mind, that we cannot allow this to happen. African countries can no longer further be indebted and turned radioactive. We see a massive marketing of nuclear power in Africa by trying to hoodwink or give false hope that nuclear is a solution to climate change, and we know it's not. It's carbon intensive. From South Africa to Egypt, nuclear, it's not necessary. We have abundant resources of renewable energy, and this is where a greater investment has got to happen. And this is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been saying all over the time when the UNFCCC is meeting through their assessment reports, that we need to move towards a low carbon economic development. Evidence of people's lands and uranium mined has told us that this is too costly, but all the other issues that are being raised, the concerns that have been raised by people about whether nuclear is a solution to climate change, it cannot. It's a violation. Actually, we don't want to see what has been happening in the past, and that we cannot allow it to happen. It's too costly for our climate, and so it should not continue. Thank you.
Next, I would like to introduce two representatives of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize winning organization, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. First, Karina Lester, who's an ambassador to ICANN.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Karina Lester. I'm a Yankunytjatjara woman from the Western Desert region in South Australia, back in Australia. But I'm also a second-generation survivor of British nuclear tests that took place in our traditional lands. And there were two locations, Emu Field and Maralinga, Yarrowdja. And so those traditional lands have now been contaminated after 70-odd years of testing program that took place in the 50s and 60s as well. So First Nations peoples in Australia are often and continue to be pressured by the industry from that dark history of the testing that took place in the 50s and 60s through to mining on our traditional lands of uranium, but also the constant pressure of being the waste dump of this industry as well. This has been a huge impact on First Nations peoples, and constantly we are needing to fight and speak up strong against this industry on how we as First Nations peoples are constantly in the struggles and needing to fight against this. Recently, our Australian government coalition, the opposition, made an announcement around nuclear power plants, and these plants have been identified, of course, on Australian soil, but on our traditional lands, and we are very concerned around this. Many First Nations peoples across the nation are concerned about what this looks like and the impact that it will have on Indigenous peoples. Now, we often face Aboriginal people, First Nations peoples in Australia, a disproportionate burden on our communities, constantly pressured by our government, and this recent announcement is a huge concern and pressure on First Nations peoples. We've been very active in voicing our concerns, and that Australia needs to hear carefully from First Nations peoples across our nation, and that we send a strong message that we are not interested in nuclear power plants on our traditional lands. We've here today, we've heard about the expense to set these up, and so there'll be a huge burden for Australia and for many of the next generation. And again, Australians will be facing the struggles of this, and First Nations peoples will be faced with this struggle on this as well. It is our cultural responsibility to look after our traditional lands. It is our cultural responsibility to protect our people and the next generation as well. Our intangible cultural heritage is who we are. And these have been challenged over the many decades, from that testing program through to now, the very high risk of nuclear power plants on our traditional lands. So from First Nations peoples of Australia, we say no to anything nuclear and nuclear power connected as well. Thank you.
And next I'll introduce Dave Sweeney of the Australian Conservation Foundation and a co-founder of ICANN.
Thank you. It's very good to have the opportunity to speak here today, and to speak after Karina is a privilege. We have travelled from Australia to Baku, to Azerbaijan, with a simple message that, be it from the city or the bush, Australians are concerned about and opposed to proposals for nuclear power in our country. We have had decades of this industry through mining of uranium, through bomb testing, through radioactive waste disposal plants, and all of these have been characterised by top-down imposition and successful and sustained bottom-up resistance. Australia is now facing an energy challenge and an energy choice. Our challenge is how to replace coal. Our choice is, we firmly believe, renewable. It's either renewable or it's a nuclear fuel delay, not response, but delay, that would see longer coal and far more gas. And this choice is becoming increasingly contested ahead of Australia's next federal election, which must happen before June 2025. The Conservative opposition support nuclear. The federal government, the independents, the Greens and the crossbench do not. And I'm also here to convey that a great many Australians do not support nuclear. And it's people in the street, but it's also the providers, transmitters, retailers of energy. All of Australia's energy sector has said no to nuclear and has instead promoted renewables. Australia is already 40% renewable nation. In some states and provinces, that figure is 75%. In some states and provinces, it is 100%. We are blessed with diverse and plentiful renewable resources, and unlike nuclear, these are quicker, cheaper, cleaner, safer to deploy. So today, Tim referenced the Don't Nuke the Climate International statement, with over 600 international groups committing to work actively for a nuclear-free future. There is a new Australian civil society statement presented and drafted for this forum, the COP in Baku. It has more than 30 groups, signatories on this, and they represent multiple millions of Australians across environmental, First Nation, public health, faith, trade union organisations and communities. And the Australian experience in our current struggle, it reflects the concerns of many around the world. We've heard snapshots around the world here today. Different places, similar stories, similar struggles, because we live on one shared planet that is facing urgent, pressing and escalating climate pressures, and urgent action is needed. And I'll finish with the last part of this statement, which reads, Australia and the world cannot afford nuclear delay and distraction. We stand resolute in our support for real climate action through a clean energy transition and in our opposition to false nuclear promises. Thank you.
And last, I'll introduce Dr. Bimal Kadka of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War.
I have the pleasure of addressing this esteemed gathering as a representative of International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, IPPNW. As a medical professionals, our foremost goal is prevention. Stopping the escalation of the climate crisis is vital for our survival. We believe that the nuclear energy is not a viable solution and may actually hinder necessary progress. Despite some advocating for increased nuclear power at this COP summit in the name of climate action, as a physician, I must highlight the health hazards linked to the nuclear power. As a representative of an organization dedicated to preventing a nuclear war, it is crucial to emphasize that the nuclear power fuels the development of nuclear weapons, and long-term prevention must include phasing out nuclear power. When we think of the health risks associated with the nuclear power, the first thing that understandably come to the mind are the nuclear accidents. Fukushima serves as a notable example, where the incidence of thyroid cancer, a critical indicator of health impact of radiation incident, has been significant rise since 2011. This mirrors the situation following the Chernobyl nuclear accident, which has been documented to cause 20,000 thyroid cancer cases. The nuclear power poses a significant health risk, even during the normal operations across the production chain. As a physicians, we know that the frequently cited claim by the nuclear power advocates that the ionizing radiation is harmless below a certain level is scientifically inaccurate. It's well established that there is a direct relationship between the radiation dose and the likelihood of developing health issues with no safe threshold. Ecological studies have confirmed these effects throughout the entire process of generating electricity from nuclear power. Nuclear power is rooted in global injustice. The entire nuclear chain, from uranium mining to the unresolved issue of nuclear waste, poses a significant health risk impacting vulnerable communities. The sourcing of uranium still follows a colonial patterns, and expanding nuclear power would worsen the imbalance between those who profit and those who are affected. We must champion the global justice and the human rights to health by investing in renewable energy and not perpetuating the false solution of nuclear power. Abolish nuclear power and nuclear weapons. Thank you.
And thank you, folks, for listening to that press conference, which was not widely picked up and rebroadcast by the mainstream press. So you're just lucky you were here to hear it. So I just wanted to point out one point there that kind of lost in a whole bunch of really good information about how terrible nuclear power would be in terms of trying to solve the climate crisis. And that is that the nukesters at COP are saying that they need $5 trillion US to triple the amount of nuclear power by 2050, which of course is too late. But even if they did it, even if they got all $5 trillion and tripled nuclear power, which, as Tim Judson says, is probably an incredibly lowball estimate. But even if they did that, nuclear power only produces less than 9% of the world's electricity. And so even if you triple it, you've only got it up to like a quarter of the power just for electricity. And that doesn't even touch transportation, agriculture, and all those other things which need to change. And so it would be, even if you gave them what they wanted and they delivered what they promised, which they literally never do, it would still be nowhere near enough to change anything. So yeah, just wanted to emphasize that point. Okay, so now it's time to move on with our show. And this is the point where we thank our patrons. And patrons are wonderful people who've gone to patreon.com. It's Patreon. There they searched for a Green Future. Up popped our our Patreon page, and they looked at our different levels of membership. They picked one level that matched their budget, and so every month a little bit comes out of the accounts of our patrons and comes over to us, and that is really the way we can afford to keep this show on the air. So we are very, very grateful to them. Okay, and we're grateful to Rebecca, because every week she shares a little bit of interesting knowledge with us. What are we talking about this week, Rebecca?
All right. Well, this coming Tuesday, I believe, is International Men's Day. So I thought I would do something on environmental damage and men's health. Men's health is one of the themes of Men's Day, apparently. So, yeah, environmental damage like pollutants can disrupt hormone balance, impair sperm quality, and cause infertility. Also, environmental toxins cause cancer, heart disease, and developmental issues to male offspring in utero. So that's not good. Sperm count and motility are affected by pesticides, BPAs, and some heavy metals. BPAs, I looked it up because I'd forgotten, meaning, if I ever knew to begin with, is bisphenol A, which is a chemical that's in clear, rigid plastics, including food and drink containers. Also, epoxy resins, which line food and beverage containers and in the water supply pipes. It is a phytoestrogen, meaning that it causes infertility, I believe, in both men and women. So I could not find anything about the beneficial effects on men of environmental damage. I looked, it wasn't there. How to combat it, though, is you basically just got to eat healthy. You gotta be healthier. Just try and be more nagging. You gotta eat lots of fruits and veggies because they have the antioxidants, which will reverse some of the effects of the pollutants. Exercise, limit exposure to air pollutants and chemicals. They want you to actually, figure out how to monitor the air quality and stay indoors more when it's bad, basically. Also, consider monitoring your reproductive health with a doctor. Eat lean proteins, and zinc, selenium, and vitamin D are apparently important for male reproductive health. Filter your drinking water. Buy personal care products with minimal chemicals in them. Just sort of, just read the label. If it's a short list, it's for you. Reduce UV radiation exposure. Buy ecologically friendly products, and long-term support environmental policies. Educate others about the health-environmental connection. And according to something called a toxin-free future, poor sperm quality in men's health contributes to poor sperm quality in men contributes to miscarriages in their partner too. They also recommend taking off your shoes as soon as you get in the house to avoid tracking pollutants around. Don't wear cologne or limit, just for special occasions and something. You don't want to spoil people too much anyway. And also increase dusting and vacuuming. And it does not recommend explaining to your partner why they need to do a better job with the dusting and vacuuming. I'm guessing because that might earn you a feather duster where you don't want one.
So just to be clear, you're suggesting men actually vacuum and dust themselves.
It's a thought. Yeah, for your own health.
Right, but Rebecca, if a man is like really like macho, I mean, we're talking alpha male here, doesn't that give them some immunity to environmental toxins?
The mind is a powerful thing, but scientifically speaking, we have no evidence of that.
Dang. Oh well. All right. Well, thank you, Rebecca, for that report on Men's Health and Men's Day. So
welcome.
Remember to celebrate
Men's
Day on Tuesday.
Man it up in the man room.
All right. Sounds good. Okay, on to Ecological News. Our first story is a story in Clean Technica, and it was on November 5th. And the title is Bidirectional Charging Could Save $23 Billion a Year. And essentially what happened is the Fraunhofer Institute looked at the idea of bidirectional charging, that is having your electric car be able to hook to the grid so that the grid can either take power out of it or put power back into it. And it turns out in the EU, this study was for the EU, it would save consumers about $23 billion a year, largely because it decreases what's called curtailment. And that is when there's more solar and wind than necessary, like at the height of noon on a sunny, windy day.
So you're using your car as a battery, basically.
That's right. Then you fill the car up with that electricity. And because what happens right now is there's too much power, they actually have to shut the wind turbines and the solar panels down, disconnect them from the grid. So you waste a lot of power. And so if you can dump all that power into cars, you need fewer of the big battery banks. In fact, you need 90% fewer of the big battery banks if everybody had bidirectional electric cars. And one thing that is interesting is that this benefit is mainly from cars as opposed to trucks, because electric trucks are running, all day during the day and charging at night, whereas most electric cars, you drive into work and you plug your car in, and then it sits there almost all day not being used, and that's when it can be used as this battery bank. They also estimated that it would save drivers 52% on their electric bills every year. That's about $850 US per year, which is not nothing. And this was taking into account the idea of sort of a slow adoption, a slow shift over to EVs, with like 9% by 2040, and then a much higher percentage by 2050. So some good news there. And then some interesting news from Denmark. This was in DW News, a YouTube story called Denmark's Climate Tax, Levying Fees for Farm Flatulence, which is a, very alliterative title there. Essentially what's happened is Denmark has established a tax on cattle burping. And I learned something new from this. I mean, I knew...
So what, they have a way to measure this?
Well, they have measured it, yeah.
Okay,
They've
right.
slapped, things on to
I wonder
cows
what
and
lucky lab assistant got that job.
I don't know, but they have figured out that about cows put about a ton of about 10 cows put about a ton of methane into the air every year, and methane, of course, is a much higher greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And so what Denmark's going to do is it's going to charge farmers 40 euros a year per ton of methane. So for every...
So yada yada beef going to get more expensive in Denmark.
In Denmark.
Yeah.
And one thing I did not know. Now, the reason cows create methane is that they're trying to digest cellulose, which is a very tough thing to turn into sugar. And so they have bacteria in their stomach that actually break it down and produce methane as a side product. And one thing, interesting fact that I did not know is that 90% of the methane produced by a cow, 97% of the methane produced by a cow is released in the form of burps.
Wow.
Not farts.
Okay. Wow. I did not know that either.
Yeah, we've all heard about the farting cows.
Right,
But
right.
No, it's the burping cows.
Because that makes a better story.
Those are the
really.
ones you got to watch out for, are the burpers. So now this only produces about 2% of methane emissions, or about 0.7% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. So even if they got rid of all the cows, it's not going to make that much of a difference. One thing that does make a difference is the type of feed, depending on how much grass versus alfalfa, this can make a big difference in how much methane gets produced. And this is also part of a larger project where farmers are also being encouraged to reforest large parts of their land, especially around the lakes and fjords, which are getting polluted by cattle runoff pollution. Not everybody's happy with this. The Danish Nature Conservation Association wanted to actually see reductions in the number of cows, but that won't happen. And lots of people are happy about it. It followed the Danish model, where the regulators sat down with the farmers and some organizations, eco-organizations, to come up with this solution. Greenpeace is also not happy because, again, there's no actual reduction in the number of cows. But it's just an interesting idea that you're going to actually tax the cow burping. So next story, and this way you don't go too far from Denmark. We're heading down to the UK. And the government there in the United Kingdom has put forward a plan, and this is a story: gas boilers face bans in homes within years under new government legislation. Story in The Independent on November 12th. And basically they're producing something called the Future Homes Standards, which would lower the amount of CO2 produced by houses in the UK by 75%. And this affects new construction. So essentially what they're saying is that starting in 2026, new homes in the UK can't have gas boilers. They've got to have heat pumps or some other non-methane burning way of heating themselves. And it's going to actually, it starts in 2026, but the enforcement doesn't start till 2027. What they're saying is that this is going to change the number of heat pumps installed every year from about 35,000 a year to about 300,000 a year. And some environmental groups are upset with the delay, waiting till 2027. They're saying that this means there's going to be about another 700,000 homes built with gas between now and then. But the contractors are saying that's just too fast of a ramp up. You know, we're already, it's ramping up in 2 to 3 years to go from 35,000 to 300,000. So that's as fast as they can practically do it. So it's a proposal. It's not yet law, but the way the parliamentary system works in England is that the party in power has much more power than they do in our system. So it's likely going to pass. We'll see what happens. Okay, jumping from the UK to Australia, and we had some really cool Australian accents back in our interview there. That was kind of fun. But there's a study by the Australia Institute that was released on November 11th, and the title is Why Batteries Trump Hydrogen for Buses. There's been a lot, I've been seeing a lot of things on my feed on the social media talking about how wonderful hydrogen is to run cars and buses and stuff. Well, it turns out it's not nearly as good as electric. And specifically, they did a study looking at hydrogen fuel cells. They found out that it was fuel cells are more expensive, they need more infrastructure, and it turns out there's no actual emissions reduction by using hydrogen as opposed to electric cars with batteries. And specifically, they found that the expense was 15 to 30 times more using hydrogen fuel cells, which fuel cells are very tricky things that need very rare metals and stuff, and they are kind of, yeah, they're incredibly expensive. If you are using solar and wind to generate the hydrogen that you're going to use to power the car, you need to generate 3 times as much power, because you lose energy changing the water into hydrogen. You know, that wastes a ton of energy as opposed to just using the electricity to charge a battery, there's almost no waste there. So you would need to have 3 times as many solar panels and wind farms to generate enough hydrogen to power these buses. And finally, there's no emission reduction, especially since a lot of the hydrogen, rather than being green hydrogen that is supplied by wind and solar, a lot of it is what they call blue hydrogen. That is, it's being generated by methane. So you're using natural gas you're taking out of the ground and turning that into hydrogen, and that takes so much energy to do that, it actually generates more CO2 than you would have avoided. So just a thought there. And there have been lots of pilot studies and pilot programs around the world where they've tried hydrogen-powered cars and hydrogen-powered buses. Basically, they're a dead end. This thing, they're being more expensive, being harder to run, and there's more moving parts, and all those things are true. So don't fall for it. Next story, and this is a story off of YouTube from the DW, which is, I believe, Deutsche World News.
Deutsche Welt.
Deutsche Welt, thank
Deutsche
you.
Welt.
News. This was on November 13th, and the title is Legal Victory for Oil Giant Shell. What does it mean for the environment? So, unfortunately, this is some bad news.
I'm guessing not something good.
Right. Back in 2020, a bunch of environmental groups took Shell to court in the Netherlands, and they won. They got a ruling that said Shell had to reduce its emissions of global warming gases by 45% by 2030. And their argument was that the Netherlands had just agreed to cut their CO2 emissions, and the only way to actually achieve that would be to have oil companies like Shell cut their CO2 emissions. And so they argued for, and the judge agreed, that Shell had to cut them by 45% by 2030. Shell appealed it, he took this to the Dutch appeals court in The Hague, and the appeals court gave a very confusing response, which actually made things very easy for Shell. They said they agreed that, since the Netherlands have agreed to this, Shell is bound by that, and so that they do have to reduce their emissions. But they can't be held to any specific number. So you can't, the court, the appeals court is saying that the lower court couldn't tell Shell 45%, even though, the environmental groups had numbers and figures to back that up. They said it's not, you can't impose any specific requirement. And so that, in other words, they just created this tremendous loophole. The case was brought by Friends of the Earth in Netherlands, and they are looking like they're going to take it to the Dutch Supreme Court. So this battle is not over, but it's a huge setback for environmentalists. Alrighty, now next story. Unfortunately, as part of COP, every year they do a check on how much greenhouse gases have actually been emitted. And last year we reported on this. We said there was a 0.8% rise, and there was a lot of hope that this year would mark the flattening out, that this year we wouldn't rise, that we'd break even, and then we could start going down in future years. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. In 2024, we have another 0.8% rise in CO2 emissions over 2023. Now, we need to reduce by 43% by 2030, which is just 6 years. We need to reduce CO2 emissions by 43% in order to stay below the 1.5 degrees centigrade target that was in the Paris Climate Accords. Everybody was very happy last year because for the first time the COP statement said we need to transition away from fossil fuels, but we haven't. So now 22 countries, a little bit of good news, 22 countries have decreased their CO2 emissions, including the UK, Germany, and the US. But the world is still emitting about 4 million tons an hour. And most of that increase was from natural gas. They went up 2.4%. Oil went up 0.9%, and coal only went up 0.2%. But the biggest polluters in the world are China and India, with they're continuing to build new coal plants. Now, these figures also calculated in deforestation, which normally the forests of the world are a carbon sink. But as we've reported before, this past year, they've actually become a carbon source because there's been so many forest fires that the world's forests ended up putting more carbon in the air than they took out. And specifically, that happened in forests in Brazil, Indonesia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So, once again, the big question, we're making the transition. Are we making it fast enough? Will we survive? At this point, the answer is no. No, we are not making the transition fast enough. We are making the transition, but at the rate we're going, it's kind of like, okay, we're heading into the wall at 120 miles an hour. We have decided to put the brake on. At the same time, we're continuing to push on the accelerator. So we may only hit the wall at 110 miles per hour, but at this point, we're still heading for that wall. All right, so last story, and this is, I decided to end on a little bit of positive news here. The Athens Independent here in Ohio, Athens, Ohio, on November 15th, no evidence Athens County fracking waste contaminated well water, ODNR says. So there were two fracking wells, or two produced by K&H Partners and Reliable Enterprises, that have contaminated the water around them. And that was this contamination was discovered 2 years ago, and there's been since then they've been forced to shut those wells down because they obviously are leaking into the groundwater. And so the state of Ohio hired some private contractors, Patriot Engineering, and they tested 22 wells that were in a half-mile radius around those fracking wells, 22 drinking water wells, and so far they have not found any contamination. And fracking wastes, of course, are filled with PFAS and radiation. They're radioactive, interestingly enough. And so that's good information, good thing that they haven't found any waste there in people's drinking water wells. Now, only 22 wells out of about 300 actually agreed to go along with the study and let them come take the samples. So this is not a comprehensive test. And also, a lot of the people who are pushing to shut the wells, including a woman named Roxanne Groff, who've been fighting the fracking for many years down there, are not happy that this is a one-off. They say this should be something that happens every year because it takes a while for these poisons to migrate through the soil and stuff. But at the moment, it doesn't look like any actual drinking wells have been contaminated yet. So that's good news. Okay, well, we're done, and we have just about a minute left here. So if anybody wanted to make a really quick phone call, we'd be happy to take it.
Also, you should probably be aware that the month of November is National Peanut Butter Lovers Month.
Peanut butter lovers.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Well, that makes sense that peanut butter and Man Day go together.
Totally, yeah. Yada yada. Long story short, they're pretty good for the environment, but you gotta pay attention to whether they're being farmed sustainably or not. So
Men or peanuts are you talking about there?
both, really.
Both.
I don't know.
All right. Well, that actually brings us to the end of our show. Thanks very much for sticking with us for yet another episode of For a Green Future. My name is Joe DeMare.
And I'm Rebecca Wood.
And we are signing off.
I don't want no oil, a spoiling my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things a creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No,